Great. Now, our first session this morning is Global Outlook, Navigating Trade and Investment Trends in 2025. Angela Ellard, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. I just had a quick chat with her. Very interesting lady. Will deliver opening remarks setting the stage for a dynamic discussion on global trade. Following her remarks, I will welcome her to co-panelists to join her. This session was developed in partnership with the Washington International Trade Association, known as WITA. These top experts will discuss the key developments that will define international trade and investment in the year ahead. Now, please join me to welcome Angela Ellard to the stage.
I like walking up to walk-up music. It just sets a tone, I think. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in Marseille, a city that's long been a vital hub for trade, connecting Europe with the rest of the world through its historic port. And thanks, of course, to the World Trade Centers Association and the Washington International Trade Association for organizing this session and for the invitation. Since its establishment, the World Trade Organization has undeniably fostered global trade, promoting stability and driving economic growth for its members, its member economies. Lately, however, its value has been increasingly questioned, particularly in light of recent actions. Today, I'd like to talk about why the WTO should matter to you and the significant benefits it's delivered to its member economies and to business. Benefits that continue to underpin global trade, much like the port of Marseille has for centuries. This year marks the WTO's 30th anniversary, and almost 80 years ago, its precursor, the GATT, was founded in the aftermath of World War II. The WTO sets the economic rules of the road for its 166 member economies. We are driven by members. Decisions are made by members. The WTO is its members. And members make decisions by consensus. That means everyone must agree, or at least not to disagree, to adopt a decision. It's not majority rule. Everyone is at the table. Each member has an equal voice, regardless of size, political system, or economic might, as well as the power to block any decision. No single member dominates the room, not the United States, which accounts for 15.9% of global goods imports, nor China with its share of 12.8%. Now, reaching consensus among 166 members, as you can imagine, is not easy. And negotiating international agreements is a long-term endeavor. However, when consensus is reached, it should mean that all members are committed. They own the agreement, and I like to think it's more durable as a result. A recent example is the agreement on fisheries subsidies concluded in 2022 by consensus among 166 members. To bring it into force, we need just 15 more members to deposit their instruments of acceptance. If you believe in the rules-based system, I urge you to encourage these last members to deposit their instruments and do their part to make fisheries economically and environmentally sustainable. Now, businesses are the direct beneficiaries of the WTO system of rules. You are exporters and importers, as well as innovators and producers of goods and services, and you participate in global supply chains. We are all aware that increased trade costs through tariffs or other trade measures, regardless of who is applying them, directly affect your bottom line. And uncertainty around market access influences important investment decisions. At this critical juncture for the multilateral trading system and for all businesses that operate across borders, your active engagement and support for the system are more important than ever. These days, it's tempting to think of trade as just being about tariffs. And in fact, the recent additional duties announced by the US and by some other countries in response are a huge test to the international trading system. While the situation is rapidly evolving, the WTO Secretariat's initial estimates suggest that these measures, along with those introduced since the beginning of the year, could lead to an overall contraction of around 1% in global merchandise trade volumes this year. This would represent a downward revision of nearly 4 percentage points from previous projections. This is undoubtedly significant. The system has weathered consequential stresses over the years, but for it to withstand, it's crucial that our members and businesses continue to recognize its benefits, utilize its tools, and make it better. And let us remember that the WTO and trade are about so much more than tariffs, and the WTO is designed to manage a wide variety of trade issues. First, the WTO regulates trade in services. Remember them? We talk about goods so much now with tariffs that we really need to remember the importance of services as well. And in fact, global trade in services, including digitally delivered ones, is booming. While tariffs and manufacturing dominate the conversation today, in some countries, services have become the major contributor to the economy. And of course, services is a vital component of manufacturing as well. You can't manufacture without services. As to digital trade, WTO Secretariat economists estimate that digitalization will boost services shares of total world trade to 37.2% by 2040. Digitally delivered services, everything from remote consulting to streamlining video, are already the fastest growing segment of global trade, quadrupling in value between 2005 and 2023 to $4.25 trillion. Many WTO members are working to develop rules governing digital trade, including through a plurilateral initiative on e-commerce at the WTO, Coalition of the Willing. So first, trade and services. Second, WTO rules protect intellectual property, fight illicit trade, and allow rights holders to enforce their IP rights. These rules are vital for businesses to grow, thrive, and innovate. Third, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which came into force in 2017, has streamlined customs procedures, reduced red tape, and increased regulatory transparency. This has made cross-border trade faster, cheaper, and more predictable for businesses of all sizes, boosting global trade by over $230 billion. These norms have been an essential tool for developing members as well to reform and reap the benefits of the trade system. Fourth, WTO rules compel governments to rely on international standard-setting processes and sound science when adopting sanitary and phytosanitary and other regulatory measures. These rules bring transparency and the opportunity for business to make its voice heard when new rules are being considered, and they limit the use of standards as a trade barrier, while retaining the ability of governments to regulate in the public interest. And fifth, we at the WTO are about determining rules relating to the origin of goods and the value of those goods, critical components for trade. In sum, the WTO is about so much more than tariffs. Its rules and enforcement mechanism have helped reduce the share of people living in extreme poverty from 40% in 1995 to under 11% in 2022. Given the breadth of its work and the significant economic achievements it's helped drive, the WTO delivers an excellent return on investment for a budget of just over $200 million, 200 million with an M. It's also important to remember that despite the new tariff measures, the vast majority of global trade still flows under the WTO's most favored nation, MFN terms. Our estimates indicate that this share stands now at 74%, down from around 80% at the beginning of the year. Our Director General and I have called on WTO members to stand together to safeguard these gains. Therefore, our message to WTO members navigating today's turbulent waters has been to remain level-headed in reacting, as many have done, and to consider not just the immediate effects of their reaction, but also the broader, long-term consequences on consumers, industries, and the global trading system if there were to be retaliation or other types of measures in response. Instead, there's an opportunity for dialogue and cooperation to work through issues, including at the WTO. And in fact, we've seen messages from the US just overnight that it is now open to negotiate with most members. So if you value the WTO, please help our members deliver on their negotiating agenda by working with your government and business associations. Please don't take us for granted. It is certainly the case that the trade world would be ugly, even uglier, without these rules. If you consider WTO rules inadequate or imperfect, then collaborate with WTO members to strengthen and improve them. If you think your interests are being harmed by measures taken by other members, engage with your government to make full use of the WTO's platform, whether through our vibrant committees, bilateral consultations, or the dispute settlement system. These all give you the opportunity to address and resolve these issues constructively. And as you and your governments consider how to respond to actions taken by others, I urge you to remain calm, to avoid a downward spiral that hurts everyone. Collectively, we should reinforce the message that trade, by its very nature, is a win-win and not a zero-sum game. Yesterday, while walking along the bay, I spotted the lighthouse. And I thought about trade and the WTO in that context. Even in times of uncertainty, a lighthouse stands tall and strong, protecting seafarers, symbolizing stability and security amid the storms of sea. Likewise, the WTO, through a vast array of global economic rules, assists businesses in its efforts to create security and predictability, offering a vital platform for resolving disputes and promoting trade. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I definitely love the example about the lighthouse. And I believe we are a lighthouse also. We are a lighthouse to all our WTCs. And yeah, there's a road. So another thing you said, opportunities and be calm. I think it's very important we take those on board. Now, I would like to welcome onto stage the rest of the panel. I will start with Penny Nuss, lead GMF Allied Strategic Competitiveness German Marshall Funds of the United States. Next, Iana Dreyer, founder and editor of Borderlex. Lionel C. Johnson, president of the Pacific Pension and Investment Institute. Calling on a friend now. Your friends too. Ed Allison-Wright, director of World Trade Center Gibraltar, member of WTCA Board of Directors. And moderating the session is Mr. Ken Levinson, CEO of WITA.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and to be with our friends from the World Trade Centers Association, John Edrew, and Maureen Pace from the Drew Company, Crystal Eden with the World Trade Centers Association, and Allison Brown McKithen with the Washington, D.C. World Trade Center in Washington, D.C. You've been great partners and friends of WITA for many years, and we're delighted to be here with you all today. WITA started in Washington 40 years ago, and today we are a global platform for timely and thoughtful debate about some of the most pressing issues in international trade, and we're delighted to be here with all of you today. We're going to jump right in. You've heard the introductions of all our panelists, so we don't need to give lengthy introductions. Angela, thank you for your remarks. As someone who's been around the WTO for a long time, it's been around for 30 years now. You and I first met during the creation of the World Trade Organization in the early mid-90s. As it celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, it's clear in your remarks as well that it's created significant value. However, a lot of the rules have remained unchanged in that time since 1995, which has led to some questions about its relevance. In this context, where do you think the WTO stands today? And you've mentioned in your remarks some of the important things that it's doing, but how does it remain relevant in the global trade landscape?
Well, yes, the WTO has been around for 30 years, and with its predecessor organization, even around for 80 years. And in order to remain relevant, we have to constantly adapt, constantly make sure that the tools that we provide our members are fit for purpose. So I think this takes a variety of forms. One is that the structures still remain very strong in terms of trying to resolve disputes. The rules that we have in place on goods, on services, and IP have stood the test of time, but there's no doubt that there's significant tension in terms of how those rules are enforced, particularly when it comes to tariffs and whether members can impose tariffs on each other when they're committed to a certain level of tariff. So the WTO we have these mechanisms to address them. The first thing, you don't want to jump right into litigation. You actually want to create a forum for discussion, for conversation. And so we do that through consultations that are required. before you can even bring a trade case. There are also committees. We have committees covering everything from services to intellectual property to trade in goods. And these tools are used quite often. In fact, we have a meeting tomorrow of the Council on Trade in Goods in which we expect hundreds of matters to be brought. Some of them will relate to tariffs, but most of them will not. And these have been disputes that members have tried to work out. And the interesting thing is that only about a quarter of them end up in litigation. So members really try to resolve these disputes. But in addition to the structures, we also have to provide an opportunity for negotiating aspects of trade that have become more important to our members. So I mentioned in my remarks the negotiation on the agreement on fisheries subsidies. This is to end the most harmful forms of fisheries subsidies that's led to overcapacity, overfishing, really risking the state of fish stocks all over the world, so that by some measures, only half of fish stocks are sustainable. That's really a disaster if that continues to deteriorate. So our members came together and actually reached an agreement on that by consensus. It was enormously difficult, but it can happen. We also have opportunities for members to negotiate in smaller groups, what we call plurilateral negotiations, where they can get together and talk about domestic services regulation or investment facilitation for development or e-commerce, where we're doing a lot of work among a coalition of willing and also more broadly. So the system of negotiation is actually quite vibrant, but it is slow. These things don't happen overnight, and we want durable agreements in which every member can participate. So the work continues, and we need also to consider what things we should do to reform it. I'm not saying the WTO is perfect, far from it. It has to evolve to meet the needs of members. As our members change, as trade changes, as AI becomes more of an influence with respect to trade, we have to be adaptable. And that's what we're trying to do in working with our members.
That's, I know those of us here on the panel certainly know all the great work you're doing, and we are very grateful to you and the other members of the Secretariat and the professional staff at the WTO who do just amazing work and have for so many years. Now, Penny, coming to you next. I'm reminded of something many of you might remember when Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, and he came up at a press conference and said there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And I feel like in U.S. trade policy, we're somewhere between the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns. And I'm not sure if people quickly grab their phone and run out of here today, I think we're going to know something that the president's been tweeting in the middle of the night. But U.S. trade policy, those of us who've been in trade for a long time love it when trade has like a one-day news cycle. We announce a new agreement, it disappears, and we don't talk about it again. Certainly that's not been the case in the last few months, and certainly the last week since the president announced his Liberation Day tariffs. Can you update the audience on what you're thinking and hearing about the direction of U.S. trade policy in this very interesting time we're living in?
Well, sure. Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you to all of you for having us here today to talk about these issues. So I'm with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We were founded in 1972 as a gift from the German government to thank the United States for the Marshall Plan post-World War II. And we're based on three kind of key principles: democracy, security, and prosperity. And so I think today's theme and panel really plays into the prosperity piece, because I think that's what President Trump and frankly all of us are grappling with today, which is what does prosperity in the future look like? So how did we get here? Well, there's a lot of noise, and I think there's a lot of ups and downs. But if you go back 40 years and you watch Donald Trump speak about trade with Japan in the 80s, you will hear almost the exact same language that he used in the press conference last week. It's about being ripped off. It's about, it's a whole victim mentality with regards to how the United States has been treated by our allies since the end of World War II. So in Trump 1.0, he tested out certain things, but he was restrained by, I think, the fact that it was a new administration, that they hadn't really thought through a lot of the policies that they wanted to implement. And so Trump 2.0 is very different than Trump 1.0 in that he is relatively unrestrained at this point to implement the ideas and the things he's been thinking about for years. Now, the other thing that I think we have to be aware of is that his policies are relatively popular in the United States. And polling has talked about how people like the tariffs. In part, they like the tariffs because it feels like a very active policy. And if you know and understand a lot of the things Angela has been talking about with international trade today, many of those are about expanding the pie and about working together. And they're not as intuitive maybe as a tariff and throwing a tariff down. Tariff is a tax on imports, but it's been spun as what other people pay for. And with all the complaints coming out of other parts of the world, that just kind of reiterates the president's point that it's the foreigners that are going to pay for the tariffs. So, but I think the real end of the day, if I had to think about where we head, what we've really had is, in the United States, a lack of robust domestic policies to help U.S. citizens address and deal with the ramifications of the global economy and changes that are going on to make sure that the United States remains competitive. We've relied on the market for many, many years to reallocate capital and to reallocate resources in an efficient way. But there have been communities in the United States that have been left behind. And it's those communities that I think are in particular feel that Donald Trump is fighting on their behalf today and is helping them maybe become competitive again in quite an unsettled world. And international trade, I think, largely takes the blame for that lack of adequate domestic policies in the United States. And that's what you're seeing shake out in the U.S. Thank you.
It's interesting. I'm reminded when, and Angela might remember this, and you too, Penny, because you were at the Commerce Department in the early 90s, there was a competitiveness bill that was moving through the Congress early in Bill Clinton's tenure that was supposed to accompany, I think, some of these trade initiatives, and it never got anywhere. It never got out of the Congress and got passed, and that could have made a difference maybe if the U.S. had tied some domestic policies at that time to the expansion of world trade that was going to happen with the WTO. Iana, thank you for joining us. Love to hear a little bit more about what you do at Borderlex, and then talk about what's being done in Washington and how it's being viewed in Brussels.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you. I'm very pleased to be on this panel today. Yes, I'm the founder and editor of Borderlex. We are a niche publication, offering news, intelligence, debate, analysis of everything on trade policy made in Brussels, but also in London post-Brexit. And we cover also what is being negotiated in the World Trade Organization in Geneva. So a very European-focused policy news outfit, if you like. We're about 10 years old. We are being followed by, this is a subscription-based organization, and we have among our subscribers, obviously, institutions, diplomats, globally operating businesses and business associations, academics, think tanks, kind of things. So it gives you a picture. But now to the substance. How is the view in Europe and mainly Brussels on what is going on? clearly great worry and uncertainty. The United States is the main export destination for European goods and services exporters. It's a key security provider on the European continent. So these two issues are deeply intertwined. There are two kind of responses: a very short-term response to specific actions of the Trump administration, obviously the tariffs. As we speak now, today, between last night and today, later today in Brussels, there will be a decision on a list of goods, about 25 billion euros worth of US exports that will be hit with retaliatory tariffs in response to steel and aluminium tariff and derivative products that were adapted last month. So it takes always a bit of time for the EU to take these decisions. And Brussels is preparing a new package of measures to propose by the end of April and probably be enacted in May. How that one will look like is much more uncertain because even European importers know that it hurts to slap tariffs on your imports. It's a tax on European consumers. And the fight for these retaliatory measures was a bit more difficult, perhaps, than anticipated initially. Also, the EU wants to be seen as supportive of the multilateral system, so it doesn't want to create too much harm, although it sees those tariffs as good leverage in conversations and negotiations with the White House. There are then also more longer-term, mid to long-term responses to the threat coming from the United States, which is tied to a general concern with having not sufficiently diversified trade relations. That has to do also with the China question. The EU has already had the experience of the first Trump administration, so this is a sort of a more slowly moving ship, but we're going in that direction, seeking, for example, new bilateral trade agreements, new market access in other regions in South America with Mercosur, new trade negotiations being launched in Asia, Asia-Pacific, Southeast Asia. We will get back to that. And there's also a general trend to try to secure supply chains, so to bring back some production to Europe in some strategic sectors like technology and green tech, to secure critical minerals, to have a more, let's say, stable and secure regional trade.
Thank you, thank you. We've been talking about policy, the US, the EU, the global trade system. We have a couple of business people here with us. My old friend, Lionel Johnson. Lionel, you have members around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about the Pacific Pension Institute, and then we'll get into a little bit of how your investors, your members, are seeing the US and global trade policy landscape.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you all for this opportunity to be with you today. I can just tell you a little bit about PPI, as it's known. It's an organization of institutional investors that's been around since the end of the Asian financial crisis, when institutional investors in North America and in Asia wanted to look to opportunities resulting from that crisis and lessons learned, and to have an environment in which they can come together at the senior levels to talk about those investment trends. And so in the period since then, and in the last 11 or so years that I've been at PPI myself, our membership has become more global. Our area of programmatic focus, however, continues to be Asia and the Asia-Pacific region, broadly defined. We gather our leaders about 3-4 times a year, and you were able to be with us at least once before. And so you see in our membership representatives from Europe and North America and Asia, Oceania as well, now West Asia and from the Gulf, looking at the serious issues of long-term capital deployment. So our membership is comprised of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, foundations, and asset managers that manage those funds for those institutions. Patient capital, long-term investment horizons of 10, 15 years. So when you look at the current moment, we were together 3 or 4 weeks ago in Seattle for our winter meeting with the looming tariff issues. There was concern. Investors of this kind don't like turbulence. They like policy certainty. and we're seeing very little of that at the moment. So this is something that is very concerning for our members, but they are looking at these issues as something that is, for the current moment, of concern, but what does it mean for the longer-term ability of the United States to participate in the global economy? And what does it mean for the rest of the world, where these institutions have invested considerable amount of money? So roughly $30 trillion is represented in our membership of assets under management or administration. So looking out to the next couple of months, we will gather again in Salt Lake City in the summer, do another assessment of the global environment. There continues to be concern. We have European members, we have Canadian members, as well as Asian members, and we hope that we can continue to be a forum for frank discussion of the trends, but again, with a long-term perspective.
Well, and that's a good segue for Ed to come into the conversation. Your company, Fair Homes Group, is one of those types of investors that Lionel was talking about. You operate various sectors across Europe, the United States, and around the world. How are you and your colleagues viewing this current trade landscape?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ken. So I'm going to break my answer into two parts because I'm wearing two hats, really. And in terms of the WTCA hat, Angela sort of struck a real chord with what our discussions have been this weekend. So John Drew, our chairman, discussed the phrase of sort of keep calm and trade on. And I think it really is about arresting that limbic response, which is to fight or flee, and actually just focus on a more considered sort of calm reaction to how we do things. As a non-political organisation, the WTCA is fortunate enough to be in a position where we continue whatever happens. So governments will come and go, but businesses will continue to talk to each other. So when you see on the screen here our subject title, the Navigating Trade, and then real estate as well in the same title. Our members that trade are now more in demand this week than they were 2 weeks ago because it's just a challenging environment. So people need to speak to them. We are now more likely to be on a platform to talk about trade as a result of the fact that trade is being talked about over the dinner table, over all of the news channels. And from a real estate perspective within the WTCA, obviously things that happen in this situation, there's a human factor, which is challenging. But beyond that, you obviously have a market factor, and you might have interest rates stumbling a little bit. In the real estate sector, we know that might potentially stress a project. If you're part of a World Trade Centers Association, you're a member of a World Trade Centers Association, you're likely to have some benefits compared to your competitor in the market when you have a real estate asset. So from that side of things, uncertainty is not bad, provided it's temporary. Now, from our sort of private sector side of things, my day job, so to speak, we have a slightly higher risk appetite. So again, we're a counter-cyclical investor. So we invest in what we believe is fundamentally strong. And we sort of look at data rather than drama. There's been a lot of drama this week, and I think the thing that makes this scenario probably stand out more than others is that there is potentially data as well. And I think if this is a negotiating ploy and a sort of a drama-driven ploy, I think as real estate investors, we will probably find that this period of time is actually quite interesting for us. If it's a data-driven scenario, I think we all have to be a bit more cautious in how we address investments, and that's probably how we're addressing it at the moment.
I think we've all been learning how different data formulas are used to calibrate tariffs these days. I was joking that it might have been interesting if they had just done it by weight. So diamond weighs this much, a car weighs this much. Angela, we've talked about the U.S. and EU, the reactions to the tariffs a bit, but I know you're hearing a lot. The Secretary General is getting calls. What is the role? What are some things that the WTO can be doing? I think that keep calm and trade on. Maybe we all need to get a little sign on our wall that says such, but maybe elaborate a little bit more on what Geneva is, what you're saying in Geneva and what you're hearing.
Well, I like the keep calm and travel on, and
Trade
carry on, trade on.
Or both.
Travel on. But we also have our own phrase that the Director General used when she was being interviewed in Davos, which was, just chill. And so that one was widely reported as well. And I don't mean to be glib about this. It's very hard to be calm when you're facing a rather existential situation where even a small tariff can price you out of the market, let alone a much larger tariff. And I think it's for members, for the countries, for the economies to decide what to do on behalf of their businesses, on behalf of their people. My sense is they're trying to do a couple of things. One is to restore us to this level of equilibrium that we had before. That's not an easy thing to do in this environment. I don't even know if it's possible in this environment. Another thing that they're trying to do is to make sure that they don't create collateral damage. So while sometimes it's tempting to shoot first and ask questions later, you have to consider what the impact would be if you were to impose tariffs. We all know what the effect of tariffs are. They don't just hit the other side. Sometimes there's some self-inflicted damage as well, as products that your people rely on become more expensive. It especially hurts when those products are intermediate goods that are needed for manufacturing. So I think that from what President Trump has been saying, there's a whole host of problems that he sees posed by other trading partners that he's trying to address. And I think seeing that some of that is the higher level, that tariffs are not reciprocal, but sometimes it's other things too. It's non-tariff barriers. It relates apparently to things like the digital services tax, other types of barriers that the U.S. sees, not to mention the question of the overall trade balance and whether that is good or not. So all of these factors seem to be coming into play, and it's really hard, I think, for an affected member, let alone a business, to know how to react to that, except to try to discuss this with the United States, not just with the U.S., but other members as well, to try to figure out how to resolve that. So the WTO offers tools for that, to bring members together. Of course, a lot of this can happen bilaterally as well. But when we're talking about the hand-to-hand combat that exists sometimes on individual products, that goes on every day at the WTO and always has, the question of friction is not new to the system. The system, in a way, thrives under this system and the efforts to try to resolve that. And then we also have to remember that the WTO and the trading system itself is about more than just trade in goods. So if the tariffs all relating to trade in goods, what about the benefits on services? What about the benefits with respect to trade facilitation, intellectual property, things like standards that are set? These are all powerful tools that members have, even if the tariff side of the house is rather
Unsettled?
unsettled. Thank you, a very good diplomatic word. Very unsettled as of now. So the rest of trade does go on, at least for the moment. And members, I think, in terms of using the WTO, like I said, our budget is $204 million per year. The member that pays the most contribution, or is that is assessed the highest contribution, is only $24 million a year, and that's the U.S. China pays just under that. So it just shows you get a lot of value for the system that is set up. And we are so eager for members to use our tools to try to address some of these concerns. It's not easy. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. It's not going to vanish overnight. It will take some hard work and trying to figure out where those rules should be changed and whether they are still working the way members want them to work.
Absolutely. And, you know, we often say in Washington that the best of the ministry's trade officials often cycle through Washington, but they also come to Geneva. And you have the members and the people that are working in Geneva are some of the best and the brightest in the world, from both the institutional point of view, but also the member countries. And I know a lot of businesses will come. There's a lot of transparency at the WTO, opportunities for businesses to weigh in, and I will encourage all of you to take advantage. Work with your governments. Go to Geneva, make your case there. Penny, you've spent a lot of time in Geneva, but also obviously in Washington and in Europe. What's happening in the U.S. is not happening in a vacuum. There's reactions all around the world. Iana's already talked a little bit about how the EU's viewing policy. How are we seeing other countries react so far to the president's announcements, and what do you expect to see in the days to come?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think one thing is I think other countries are a bit perplexed. I think it's very hard to assess what the end game of the tariff wars is at the moment, in part because the Trump administration is selling so many different messages with regards to why they're doing tariffs. They're doing tariffs to reshore manufacturing to the United States. They're rebalancing our trade deficits around the world. They want it for revenue to offset a U.S. domestic tax bill. They want it for innovation. They want it to lower interest rates. They want it for leverage in negotiations on things like fentanyl and immigration. So if you're listening to all of that, I think it's very hard to assess which one of those are they actually trying to accomplish, because many of those are contradictory. If you want to lower overall trade deficits into the United States, you're going to decline the ability to collect revenue. So I think countries are a bit perplexed. I think, going back to Angela's point, when I used to do a long time ago anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations, anything that was over a 10% tariff was considered to shut you out of the market. Now, if everybody's getting a 10% tariff, it's a level playing field. The U.S. consumer is just going to pay more. It will potentially give revenue to the U.S. government, but at the end of the day, it's not quite such a big deal. But when you get to these levels that they're talking about with China, for example, 54% plus 25% for autos is already at, I think, 100% coming out of for electric vehicles. Then you throw in 25% for iron and steel. Then you throw in 25% because they have Venezuelan oil. Then you talk about another 50% because they retaliated the other day and announced that they were going to also shut down rare earth minerals and other things. Now, it's a very complicated and challenging time to try to figure out what the off-ramp is. But what I think is most concerning is that, and all of you know this very well, trust is what underpins international trade, and trust is what underpins international investment, and trust is what underpins our global system. Probably trust but verify, trust but have enforcement clauses, but trust is what's critical. And right now, if I look at all the ramifications that come out of what's going on right now, I think the one that concerns me the most is that people now view the U.S. as an untrustworthy ally and an untrustworthy partner. And I think that is both sad, but also very problematic. And while that may be true at certain levels of U.S. society at the moment, it's not true, I think, across all levels of U.S. society. And so that's something I think we will continue to have to sort through coming out of this, and is one of those things that I think people are trying to figure out, Ken. Thank you.
You know, Iana, thank you, Penny. We've been talking a lot about the United States and the actions of the Trump administration. And Penny's mentioned an on-ramp. It looks like it seems like the EU is looking to be an on-ramp for trade with other parts of the world. The U.S., if the U.S. is pulling back behind its two big, beautiful oceans, is Europe looking to fill the void in some ways? I know they're negotiating new trade arrangements with ASEAN countries, partnerships with Japan, Mercosur, Mexico, India. China seems to be actively courting the EU again. How is Europe looking at the world with the United States pulling back to the degree it is?
Yeah, I mean, filling the void sounds a bit ambitious, but I think the main driver really is a desire to diversify markets and create new opportunities for EU exporters. This is really, I think, the number one driver, which has really revived an active bilateral free trade agreement agenda that was a bit dormant in the last 5 years before the Trump 2 administration came back in. So it was very interesting to see that within weeks of the second von der Leyen term coming into on stream, we had the final conclusion of the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement. It's taken over 25 years to negotiate this agreement. The agreement was actually ready. What they needed to find is some final compromise on deforestation management issues. That pragmatic solution came suddenly. Similarly with Mexico, a huge market that also itself needs to diversify its relationships. So it's both partners and the EU trying to diversify their relationships. So it's a real drive. Again, in the early days of January, finally, the final points that were that needed to be ironed out with Mexico on energy and agriculture, both sides were suddenly ironed out. There is an ambition to have a free trade agreement with India that would unlock a huge market. This is a huge challenge for the EU because the expectation is that you can't do a very comprehensive free trade agreement like the EU is used to, because those free trade agreements the EU does are about tariffs, but they're about a broad set of rules about intellectual property, public procurement, market access, very comprehensive. So it challenges the EU way of doing things, but it's interesting that the EU is thinking aloud about having different formats of free trade agreements. And then there was a revival of free trade agreements with ASEAN countries, which is one of the fastest growing region in the world, a region that was actually also very strongly hit by the tariffs last week by the US. So Vietnam was pretty shocked. An agreement exists with Vietnam that will be upgraded, for example. New negotiations have started with Thailand, relaunch with Malaysia, are pretty maturing at the mature stage with Indonesia. It's not certain that every negotiation will lead to success, but there will be a few successes there. And these are quite important markets there, especially if you then put them together. There is also a domestic agenda that ties into the international agenda, is that there is a sort of walking back on some of the most egregious, bureaucracy-inducing measures of the Green Deal that was enacted in the last term of von der Leyen. We're talking about the carbon border adjustment, deforestation rules, corporate sustainability, due diligence. All these rules came on stream in the last months of the von der Leyen administration. Raised hackles domestically because it's a lot of red tape, and it also raised hackles with partners internationally who face this red tape. So there's now an attempt at keeping the goals, but also simplifying rules, especially for SMEs, to have dialogues in place with trading partners, to have mechanisms within those free trade agreements that create also joint institutions and dialogue platforms to make it easier for all these partners to comply, more time, more lead times. So there's a sort of a return to a form of pragmatism in Brussels, which is quite interesting to observe there, and also a readiness to step in also with developing countries with new types of partnerships and aids that is partly self-interested. It's obviously about getting access to critical raw materials for the EU's industrial policy, etc. But there's also really a willingness to be there alongside China to offer a credible alternative for these countries. Let's see how that works, but that's the new approach, and some of it will lead to some results at some point. That's for sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Thinking of those results, Lionel, Iana mentioned there's EU is in discussions with ASEAN countries, with India. I know your organization has a lot of focus on the Pacific. It's in your name. Are regional frameworks like RCEP, bilateral agreements, making certain countries more attractive for your investors? Or are some of the geopolitical tensions, South China Sea, et cetera, creating counterbalances to those incentives?
Yes.
Next.
So the first part of your question, I think, one of the perhaps unintended results of the current tariff war, if you will be countries looking anew to their trade economic relationships with China. And that, I don't think, is what President Trump intended, but I think that could be the result. And so for us, we've always considered China to be an important market, market turbulence notwithstanding political considerations, but overall, China continues to be enormously important, as are Japan and Korea. But for me, the ASEAN region is probably the most dynamic because of its demographics, the economic success that we have seen in countries like Vietnam, and I regret very much how much that country is being punished now for its success. But the region itself, 10 countries working together in the RCEP framework, I think poses a real challenge for others to sort of catch up. In that vein, I think we look to deepening our relationships with the countries in the region. I'm going to Malaysia and to Indonesia in just a few weeks' time to deepen those relationships. We'll be in Australia later this year for our Asia Pacific meeting. India continues to be a country of great promise and one that our members are very much interested in. We have Indian members that are participating in PPI, so I think that the opportunity for India to broaden its trade relationships through bilateral and regional cooperation is important. And more, I think West Asia is also promising for our membership, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates being very interested in forging relationships, investment relationships with the rest of Asia, and hopeful that we can continue to be a conduit for those discussions and those investment dialogues.
That's thinking of those different dialogues and the different kind of decisions that investors are making. Ed, what's the message you want to policymakers to hear? At typical WITA events, we have about a third of our audience are government officials from either the U.S. or foreign governments. What are things that can be done by policymakers today? Setting aside the tariffs for a minute, but what are some decisions and policies that can be adopted by policymakers around the world to help create a more vibrant investment climate for your members or for your company and colleagues?
Well, actually, the two hats that I wear actually align on my answer, I think. So, and it was really refreshing actually to hear what Lionel's just said, because the areas that the WTCA is experiencing most growth in is Asia Pacific at the moment. So India has been just a fantastic area for our growth. So, I mean, to be honest, if we're in an environment where trade appears more challenging, like I said earlier, the World Trade Centers Association helps to bridge a gap by creating connections across our global network. So, one of the things that I think discussions with local politicians, municipalities that would improve trade would be to actually encourage World Trade Centers in those cities where they don't exist. I mean, from a real estate perspective, as a company, my day job, that's what we're doing. I mean, it's no surprise that we're a multi-license holder. We do that because the markets that we invest in real estate, we also buy a World Trade Center license for those cities because we believe in delivering through the WTCA. And what that does from a policymaker's perspective is, we go into a city. I won't name one, so it could potentially fit any of your examples wherever you're coming from, and we can talk to those policymakers and suggest that we can fulfill some of their economic development goals by creating this or bringing this network to their city. And the great thing with the WTCA is that actually the brand and the name of the brand, it's not personalised to us. So actually one of the most fulfilling things for policymakers with the WTCA is that they almost take sort of ownership of that asset as well. It becomes one of the city's assets, an economic asset of the city that we're based in. So yeah, my advice, I'm going to shamelessly plug the WTCA at a WTCA event, is get a WTCA license. That's actually the best way in which to put a city on the global map, and even better in this economic climate at the moment.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, and we have several questions have populated. I've got a device here with those questions popping up speedily here. I'm going to direct one to Penny and Iana, if I may, to both of you. It's an interesting question and an interesting way to put it. If there were no retaliatory tariffs threatened or proposed, what would motivate the U.S. government to negotiate agreements with these countries? What would be left to negotiate? Penny, do you want to jump in on this first?
Yeah, so I think when I look at some of the stuff that's going on and being talked about out there, I mean, there's a lot of other things besides retaliatory tariffs. And I think if you think about Europe, for example, if Europe wanted to retaliate against the U.S., I think they'd have to put in place a 50% tariff on goods that they buy from the United States. And so that has real implications on your importers in terms of cash flow. That has real impacts on your consumers. And so I think both China, Europe, and other countries are looking at what we would call asymmetric measures that they can use to negotiate or to bring the United States, bring to the negotiating table with the United States. So China has TikTok, for example. China has rare earth minerals that only they have and only they refine. And they're blocking those, the export of those minerals to the United States. There are a lot of things on services. It's hard to tariff a service, but there are other things you can do to U.S. service providers to potentially bring the United States to the table. U.S. agriculture is another quite vulnerable sector with regards to retaliation. But the U.S. has, because of the last trade wars, actually has gone to being a net importer on agriculture in the last few years, and really only exports commodities now in the agricultural sector, which is a shift and not, I think, a great one for our country because of what tariffs did to that sector over the past 10 years. So I think there are other things, but those would be the ones that I can think of. And then last would be the geopolitical. A lot of people attribute what Trump is doing to being geopolitical. So Greenland and what's going on with Greenland, what's going on with Ukraine, what's going on with trying to grab critical mineral deposits around the world and competing with Europe and with others on that is something else that people are putting out there. And I think there is a blending on some of the security issues with the trade issues that will be important for countries to consider when they want to come to the negotiating table with the United States.
And Iana, I know that there's different countries within the EU. It's not a unified bloc in every way, with different wanting to react differently to what's going on right now. And there's EU recently passed an anti-coercion instrument. What are some of the other policy mechanisms, and how are these being discussed right now in Brussels?
Yeah, I think it's the point that Penny raises is fundamental. I mean, there is an understanding that a lot of this has to do with a long-term geopolitical shift. And also compared the experience of this Trump administration compared to the first is that there is more issue linkage coming out of Washington with trade issues. Last time it was really about the deficit and car tariffs and German exports of cars and all these kind of things. And there, the retaliation that is being a bit reproduced this time around has worked a little bit to calm down the first Trump administration. Those car tariffs didn't come in the end because it was a first salvo. This time around, it feels very different for the EU, and there is indeed a debate on whether to use some instruments that were devised partly more with China in mind in the last years that might be used to respond to some perhaps more worrying demands from the Trump administration on territory. We look at Greenland, on the situation in Ukraine. So there have been new instruments developed. There was an economic security strategy that was devised for the first time in 2023. Normally, the EU doesn't deal with security. This is a national prerogative within the treaties. So member states are very reluctantly giving away some centralized powers to the EU. But there's increasing recognition that there needs to be some EU-wide response because alone you can't deal with it. So there's been this strategy in 2023, and there have been new regulations, especially the anti-coercion instrument that everyone talks about. It's an instrument by which the EU could, in comparatively short time, with a sufficient majority of member states, pull out economic nuclear bombs, if you want, sort of just remove IPR, intellectual property protections, rescind some public procurement contracts, target in foreign investments in a member state. There is also, however, a lot of reluctance to go down that route just now. There's been a lot of talk about it in Brussels, but also there's a sense that maybe it might be too early. It's also a bit of a scary prospect for many member states who feel that this could lead to a negative spiral. On the other hand, much depends on how the Trump administration will react to these first tariffs and how things go. So we will see what happens in 1 month. But I think where one needs to watch the transformation in the EU is on the defense front and on the security front more broadly. This will affect trade, this will affect investment decisions. The defense sector will be boosted a lot. This affects the whole supply chain policy of the EU. This will affect the whole tech and cyber sector. So we will see a lot of movement there that is not directly linked to bilateral trade wars, but will definitely influence the business landscape in the next years. What I see missing a little bit from the EU, and I do regret that, although there's always lip service paid to the WTO multilateral trading system, something more forceful in terms of reaffirming multilateral trading rules, because the EU, because it is not a state, still needs to have these sort of a level playing field and rules-based trade and judicial settlement of disputes instead of this hard power game where the EU is less well equipped overall than, for example, China or the United States. Maybe a call there to think of the longer term here too.
Thank you, Iana. Lionel, you got your start in Washington working for some giants in U.S. foreign policy, George Shultz and James Baker.
Now you're going to show how old I am. Yeah.
But it plays into one of the questions that was here is how do you recommend the U.S. can rebuild trust in relationships?
By behaving differently and having respect and a degree of humility and recognizing that it needs to share the global stage with other countries. The U.S. contributed a lot to the international system, for the last 80 years. And in just months, we were watching all of that sort of crumble. And as someone who's devoted his whole career to elements of the international system and upholding it, it's very concerning for me as a private citizen now. And I think, my expectations for the current administration are what they are. They're not going to change. Donald Trump is not going to change. But I think future leaders of the U.S., and there are people who aspire to succeed him, will have to behave differently. Because in large measure, the U.S. gave us a pass in the first Trump administration. They're not going to forgive us for this one. And the world is going to move on, and we're going to have to catch up and earn that respect again. And so that's just the way I see it.
I want to. It's hard once it's been lost to rebuild it, and trust is the currency of the realm in governance between countries, within capitals. We've all been part of that. I'm going to take a lightning round because we've only got a short time left. Same question for everybody. Going to start with Ed, and it's one that came from our audience, but I'm just going to tweak it slightly because I love to end on a positive note when we have these kinds of sessions. So. What is a positive trend in 2025 that you foresee, Ed, that could help and positively influence the business environment and or the trade environment? We can go with that either way. Ed, do you want to give positive? We don't
Positive trend.
Positive trend that we can see.
You sure you want to start at this end?
Yeah.
Well, look, a wise person once said, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity." So I think if we take away some of the stuff that's been happening in the last few weeks, there has been a huge amount of progress on AI, and all of us collectively, we've discussed this over the weekend. I think, the drama aside, that is still extremely interesting, and I think the positive trend for us over 2025 will be embracing AI in everything that we do, whether it's in real estate, whether it's in trade, or whether it's in how we assess investments. So yeah, that would be focusing on AI in spite of everything else that's going on.
Very good. Lionel?
I think I would echo that, but just what I'm also seeing by virtue of our members and their investments is the future leadership in some of the key countries. Very inspiring leaders that are coming to government and into the private sector leadership in some of these key markets. And so a generational change is happening in Asia, and it will happen elsewhere too. But for me, it's an optimistic trend.
Iana?
Maybe from our publication's perspective, it's the history of the publication, but also what we've been covering. It's a British publication that I founded in the UK 10 years ago as a dual French and German citizen. So we've gone through Brexit, we've gone through Trump 1, we've gone through the pandemic. So I think one of the things that brings me some hope is the ongoing EU-UK reset, which is important for trade and for security, and which might bring new opportunities, to put it that way, this year and the next years. Thank you.
Fantastic. Penny?
So I think it's asking the right questions is what's going on out there at the moment. And I think it's an outstanding time to address some long-standing challenges and problems that we've seen that are out there at the moment. And I'm excited about that and about how to shape what the future holds.
Great. Angela, bring us home.
Well, I was afraid that you were going to leave me with nothing left to look at in terms of positive, because it's not an environment where you wake up every morning and think of the positive. Right. But I do see one positive, that right after COVID, there was this sense on supply chains that we needed to become more insular, that we needed to change globalization, we needed to de-globalize. If anything, I think recent developments have definitely shown various economies the value of making more resilient supply chains, in finding partners perhaps that they had not found before. There's a tremendous opportunity for developing countries, I think, in these newly designed supply chains that build more resilience. I think there's also leading this re-globalization, as we call it at the WTO, has been this sense of the counterfactual, that if we were to divide into two blocks, it would mean a loss of double-digit growth loss for the world, which is highly significant, of course, not just for business, but for the people. So I think there is some hope in seeing how businesses who are always resilient will find a way.
Well, thank you. Thanks to our panel. Thank you all for sticking with us through this really interesting conversation. Angela, Penny, Iana, Lionel, Ed, thank you.